29:31 through Genesis 30:24. And as I have said many, many times in our study of Genesis several years ago and today, there's no way that I could ever say all that could be said or should be said in our study of Genesis. And it's certainly true in such a lengthy passage, but I'm convinced that to do two messages in this section of Scripture would not be the best way to approach it. So we are going to cover this in one message today. And as you look at the number of verses, you might think we're going to be here a very long time, but we're not. It's going to be a pretty normal message. And we're going to go through this fairly quickly because to dig out everything that could be dug out would probably bring you into a nap far more quickly than you might be otherwise accustomed to. So last time we looked at Jacob's wedding, and Jacob had worked 7 years to marry his beloved Rachel, but on the night of his wedding, good old Uncle Laban pulled a fast one and switched the older sister Leah in Rachel's place. And since Jacob was likely inebriated from the wedding night feast, which was a drinking party amongst the men, and because the ancient wedding celebrations are very different from what we would experience here in America, that switch was somewhat easy to accomplish. So after the wedding had been consummated and in the light of day of the new morning, Jacob discovered what Laban had done and is outraged at his being deceived. After confronting Laban, who hid behind the unspoken and unknown custom which required the older daughter to be married off before the younger daughter, Jacob then agreed to work for Rachel for an additional 7 years. So Laban agreed to allow Jacob to marry Rachel as long as Jacob agreed to continue to work for Laban for an additional 7 years. It is completely lost on Jacob that what was done to him, he had also done the very same thing to his own father by pretending to be his brother in order to receive the birthright blessing that Isaac intended to give to the older son Esau. Now, last week we finished with verse 30 of chapter 29. And here's what we read. Look at this with me. So Jacob went into Rachel also, and indeed he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban for another 7 years. So when we began that passage looking at the wedding of Jacob, from the beginning to that verse in 30, it covered a period of 14 years. Now, what we're going to do today is we're going to look at that last 7 years where Jacob is working for Rachel for 7 years, and this is going to be a glimpse into the 7 years that Jacob has actually worked for Rachel. This is going to chronicle the birth of Jacob's children during the 7 years that he worked for Rachel. Remember, 1 week prior to this wedding to Rachel, Jacob was single. He now has 2 wives, and they are sisters. Each of these sisters has a maid given to them by the father, and they will be presented to Jacob as concubines who will also bear children to Jacob. He went from 0 women to 4 women in a very, very short period of time. This lengthy passage is divided into 4 sections. They are marked by the word, 3 of these are marked by the word saw in 29:31, where the Lord saw, chapter 30, verse 1, where Rachel saw, chapter 30, verse 9, where Leah saw, and then the 4th and final climactic section is marked by the word remembered in chapter 30, verse 32. Now, for the sake of time, we're not going to read this entire passage, but we're mostly going to go verse by verse instead of reading it all in one shot. So in the outline, letter J, Jacob's children. Number 1, the first section, is the Lord saw. Verse 31, now the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. That's the backdrop to the entire narrative that we're looking at. The Lord saw that Leah was unloved, and he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So from the very beginning, it is key that we see God's sovereign hand is at work. God is in charge of who gives birth to whom. It is not the work of man. It is not the work of the women. God is in charge. It is God's sovereign hand. Even though through the sin of man and the dysfunction of this family, the bitter, spiteful, and conniving action of the sisters, God's purposes will be accomplished, and they have absolutely no idea of what God is doing. As far as they are concerned, they are doing what they think they have to do to earn Jacob's love, to earn Jacob's favor, to get a leg up inside the home, but all the time God is working out his sovereign plan. Letter A, the Lord saw that Leah was unloved. The Hebrew actually says that Leah was hated, but it means in comparison to the way that Jacob loved Rachel. Jacob didn't actually hate Leah, he just didn't love her. He didn't want to be married to her, but we will see that although he didn't love Leah, it didn't stop him from having children with her. For the most part, Jacob is silent in this narrative with the exception of chapter 30, verse 2, when he rebukes Rachel, as we're going to see in just a moment. So even though Leah was unloved by Jacob, and God saw that and opened her womb, letter B, Leah is going to have 4 sons. Verse 32, Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. The name Reuben means, look, a son. And Leah's hope was that this son would cause Jacob to look at her and to love her. You know, we hear this many, many times in struggling marriages. We're going to have a baby in order to save our marriage. I'm going to tell you right off the bat, that's a very, very poor reason to have a child. Never, ever, ever have a child in hopes that it's going to save the marriage. But in Leah's thinking, having a child is going to cause Jacob to all of a sudden love her. We should note that in this, Leah gives credit to God for seeing her affliction, that her husband did not love her, even though he had been tricked into marrying her. That's kind of surprising, isn't it? He didn't intend to marry me, he didn't intend to marry me, but my thinking is that if I give a son to him, all of a sudden he's going to love me. That's the way Leah was thinking. We would say, well, that's a little bit warped, but that's the way you think. It's here that we understand that Leah did in fact love Jacob, and it was very likely that she was in fact a willing participant in the switch between Rachel and Leah on the wedding night. She wasn't forced or coerced by her father Laban. It might have been even her own suggestion. Well, you know, Dad, I'm supposed to be married first, and there are no suitors in the mix. What if? And Laban may have thought, you know, that's a pretty good idea. We don't know. We can only surmise what may have been the conversation. But we can likely deduct that Leah was a willing participant in the switch, because it is her hope that by having this child, all of a sudden, Jacob, who was tricked into marrying her, is all of a sudden going to love her. Verse 33, then she conceived again and bore a son and said, because the Lord has heard that I am unloved, he has therefore given me this son also. So she named him Simeon. The name Simeon means the Lord has heard. That tells us that Leah had been praying about her unloved position. Things have not changed with the birth of the first son, so now the birth of the second son, in Leah's mind, as the result of her prayers, has brought about Simeon. The Lord knows how troubled she is, and she wanted the relationship with Jacob to be different. And lo and behold, here comes Simeon, and in her mind, this is going to be different because God has heard my prayer and has answered my prayer and blessed me with another son, and her hope is that this child is now going to cause Jacob to love me. Verse 34, she conceived again and bore a son and said, now this time my husband will become attached to me because I have borne him 3 sons. Therefore he was named Levi. The name Levi means attachment. And Leah's hope was that this third little boy would cause Jacob to become attached to her, because the first 2 had not changed Jacob's feelings about her at all. Perhaps the third one would cause some kind of attachment that had not yet come from the first 2. There has been no increase in the love. Perhaps this third one would create some new sense of attachment between Jacob and me, Leah, that the first 2 had not yet created. Verse 35, and she conceived again and bore a son and said, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named him Judah. Then she stopped bearing. The name Judah means praise, and here we see a shift in Leah's hopes. She no longer expects any change in Jacob's feelings for her. She's given up. There's no change in Jacob's love. There is no attachment from these 3 other children that have been born. And here, Leah's heart is now directed towards the Lord, and she names the child Judah, which again means praise. Now, it's unclear why she stopped bearing children. We'll talk about that in just a minute. It could have been the Lord's work in stopping Leah from bearing children, or perhaps it could have been that Rachel had forbade Jacob from being with her. We can't know precisely. But what is interesting is what unloved Leah had no way of knowing was taking place at the time, is that from Levi and Judah would flow the priestly line and the kingly tribe of Israel. Leah's blood would flow in the veins of Moses and Aaron and David and Jesus Christ, the Messiah. That came from unloved Leah, whom God saw. That's important. And Leah had no idea this was going on. That's the first section. God, the Lord, saw. Number 2, the second section, Rachel saw. Now, we have no way of knowing exactly in what order these first 4 boys were born. By way of narrative, we would assume that these first 4 were born and nothing else was born in the mix. We can't know that for certain. I'll talk more about that at the very end. Number 2, Rachel saw. Rachel has seen her sister give birth to some children, and what Rachel has seen in herself is, letter A, her own barrenness. Chapter 30, verse 1. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, she became jealous of her sister, and she said to Jacob, give me children or else I die. So the result of Rachel's barrenness, we see in letter B, is her anger. She then turns to Jacob, her husband, in verse 2 and says, she says to Jacob, give me children or else I die. Verse 2, then Jacob's anger burned against Rachel and said, am I in the place of God who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? By the way, this is the only thing we hear Jacob say in the entirety of the narrative. We hear him say nothing when Leah comes to visit him. We will hear nothing from Jacob when Leah and Rachel present the maids to him later on in the narrative. This is all we hear from Jacob in the entirety of the narrative. So Rachel is distraught. Her homely, less beautiful, unloved sister is giving Jacob sons, and she cannot. Her jealousy has overcome her, and she demands that Jacob give her children or else she is about to die. Jacob rightly rebukes her in saying that God alone is responsible for the gift of life. Letter C, we see Rachel's desperation. She says in verses 3 through 6, here is my maid Bilhah, go into her that she may bear on my knees, that through her I too may have children. So she gave him her maid Bilhah as a wife, and Jacob went into her. Bilhah conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has vindicated me and has indeed heard my voice and has given me a son. Therefore, she named him Dan. So Rachel's desperation reminds us of Sarah's desperation hundreds of years earlier when she was married to Abraham, and Sarah was barren, and she gave to Abraham her maid Hagar, which resulted in the birth of Ishmael. Now, what good came from the birth of Ishmael? Nothing. No good. It was not the plan of God. It was not the will of God. Abraham and Sarah did not consult God in what they should do in Sarah's barrenness. They took matters into their own hand, their own wisdom, and the result was absolute chaos in Abraham's home. Well, do you think it's going to be any different in Jacob's home? No, it is not. So, Rachel gives to Jacob her maid Bilhah, and of course, Bilhah gives birth. Rachel says that she may bear on my knees, which is a way of saying that she will become a surrogate mother as the result of her maid being given to Jacob. Bilhah gives birth to a son, and Rachel names him Dan. The name Dan means vindicated. In Rachel's mind, God was setting things right and was evening the score between Rachel and Leah. Leah has 4 sons and Rachel has 1. So God is vindicating Rachel because Rachel's catching up. She's giving to Jacob sons, which in Rachel's mind is a way of vindicating her in Jacob's life and in society, because in ancient societies, if you didn't bear children, there was something wrong with you. We continue here in verses 7 and 8. Rachel's maid Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. So Rachel said, with mighty wrestlings I have wrestled with my sister, and I have indeed prevailed, and she named him Naphtali. Here we get a glimpse into the heart of Rachel in regard to her sister. She has had mighty wrestlings with her and has now prevailed over her sister with another son. So the wrestling referenced here is believed to be of a spiritual nature. The word, depending upon your translation, mine is mighty wrestling. Some might say divine wrestlings or wrestlings with God. That phrase occurs only here in the Old Testament. And it is a reference to a divine element in this battle or in this struggle that Rachel was having. It could include a battle in prayer or a battle with God over her barrenness, but it seems likely that it's a battle directed towards her sister in a spiritual way, as the verse indicates. Mighty wrestlings, read it again, mighty wrestlings with my sister. So in some way, Rachel is having these spiritual wrestlings with her sister, and here through her maid Bilhah, she's had another child, which she has now named Naphtali, and the name Naphtali means look. So Rachel is saying, look, I now have a second son. The score is 4-2. I am catching up. God is vindicating me. Look, I have 2 sons. Rachel having children is all about a competition with her sister. Leah's having children is all about earning the love of Jacob. This is not what bringing children into the world is all about, but this is what it's about for these 2 women. That's the end of this second section. Number 3, this third section, Leah saw. Now, this is the most lengthy of these 4 sections, and surprisingly, this is the most sordid of the 4. This actually goes all the way to verse 21. So after Leah stopped giving birth and Rachel had these 2 surrogate sons through Bilhah, Leah decided that she needed to follow suit. So Leah follows suit, and her following suit is rooted in letter A, Leah's spite. She's not about letting Rachel continue to one-up her and having Bilhah bring sons into the family. Verse 9, when Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Holy cow. Again, it's unclear why Leah stopped bearing children, but her response was to give her maid to Jacob just as Rachel had, and as expected, her maid Zilpah also gives birth. Verses 10 and 11. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, how fortunate. So she named him Gad. The name Gad means good fortune, and Leah saw the birth of her 5th son as a means of keeping ahead of her sister, as now the score is 5-2. Verses 12 and 13. Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a 2nd son. Then Leah said, happy am I, for women will call me happy. So she named him Asher. The name Asher means happy, and Leah was happy because now she has 6 sons and Rachel only has 2. In ancient societies, the more sons you had, the more blessed you were. And on top of that, she now has 3 times as many sons as Rachel has. And that's always going to be better when you're trying to win the love of your husband and you're trying to best the sister that you're in competition with. It seems as if there is nothing that Rachel can do to outpace the children that Leah is giving to Jacob, and Leah has no interest at this point in winning Jacob's heart. She just wants to get the better of her sister. Now, as dysfunctional as this is in the family, it gets worse. Letter B, we come to the portion that is known as the bargain. This displays the darkest level of dysfunction that exists in the family between the 2 sisters. The first part of verse 14 says this. Now, in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother, Leah. So mandrakes are a perennial Mediterranean fruit, a Mediterranean plant. In the winter, they bear a bluish flower, and in the winter, they bear a plum-sized fruit. In the summer, they bear a plum-sized fruit. In ancient times, the mandrake was believed to be an aphrodisiac and would help women who were barren. So Reuben, Leah's oldest, has found some mandrakes out in the wheat field, and he brings them home, and apparently Rachel sees Reuben brings these mandrakes into the house. Letter C, in Leah's contempt. We see this in the back part of verse 14 and the early part of verse 15. Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But she, Leah, said to her, Rachel, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband, and you would take my son's mandrakes also?" And here is where we see the real issue. Leah is accusing Rachel of taking her husband away from her when Leah was likely a willing participant in tricking Jacob into marrying her. And in fact, Leah has tried to take Jacob away from Rachel. All of this time, Leah has believed that Jacob is her rightful husband, and Rachel has been trying to steal him away from her. And now Leah is saying, "You want to take my son's mandrakes as well as my husband?" We might say that Leah is delusional, or that she has some kind of a mental issue to think that she could be a willing participant in tricking Jacob into marrying her and then accusing Rachel of trying to steal her husband. But this is the way Leah thinks about the marriage relationship. So Leah wants to give the mandrakes to Jacob, thinking that it will make him desire her, and the last thing she wants to do is to give these mandrakes to Rachel, the one who stole her husband, believing that the mandrakes might open Rachel's womb and then give children to Rachel and Jacob. This is what's going on in Leah's mind when Rachel asks her for the mandrakes. So in letter D, Rachel sells Jacob. The last part of 15. So Rachel said, "Therefore, he may lie with you in return for your son's mandrakes." What Rachel says is, okay, you give me the mandrakes, and I will give you Jacob. Because Rachel thinks if she takes the mandrakes and eats them, it's going to open her womb, and then when Jacob sleeps with her, she's going to conceive. So she is trading Jacob for the mandrakes. We also get a little bit of an insight into why Leah may not have been conceiving children any longer, because Rachel may have been withholding Jacob from being with her. That may have been her prerogative as the favored wife. She may have had the privilege of deciding who Jacob could be with and how often. We don't know that. We can only speculate on that. How sordid is this? In Leah's mind, that Rachel's trying to steal the wife that I tricked, Rachel's trying to steal the husband that I tricked into marrying me, and I'm willing to exchange him for fruit, and Rachel's trying to sell her husband for some fruit that she thinks might open her womb. Is Jerry Springer somewhere around the corner? I mean, what in the world is going on? This is the level of dysfunction that exists in this family. This is the sibling rivalry that exists between Rachel and Leah. Letter E, Jacob fulfills the contract. Verse 16, Jacob's been out in the field, has no idea what's going on. When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, then Leah went out to meet him and said, "You must come into me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. And what does Jacob say? Okay. Listen to this. Just as Jacob's relationship with Laban is changed from uncle to nephew, it's exchanged from flesh and blood to employee and employer, so now his marriage to Leah has been reduced to a commercial contract. I have bought you. You've got to come in and lay with me tonight. Laban's degradation of Jacob to a shepherd under a contract has now come inside of Jacob's home, where Leah has bought Jacob to come in and potentially birth more children. Letter F, Leah gives birth. Verses 17 and 18, God gave heed to Leah. Note that. God gave heed to Leah. And she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to my husband. So she named him Issachar. Again, we see here that God is in control of Leah giving birth. And Leah acknowledges that. But she also believes that her unselfish act of giving Zilpah to Jacob played some kind of role in God blessing her with this fifth son, because she says, God has given me my wages. So in some distorted way, her buying Jacob with the mandrakes was God's way of blessing her with this fifth son. It just speaks of the incomplete understanding that she and we have sometimes of the way God chooses to do things. The name Issachar means has rewarded me. So in Leah's mind, God rewarded her with this child. Therefore, she named him Issachar. God has rewarded me. Verses 19 and 20, Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. So apparently the visiting didn't stop with just that one night. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulun. We aren't told why, but apparently Jacob is free to continue to see Leah, and she again gives birth to a son. The meaning of the name Zebulun is unclear, but it has something to do with the gift, as in a dowry, in some way perhaps the dowry that comes with this agreement between Leah and Jacob has been concluded. In some way, this will enhance Leah's relationship with Jacob is now completed. We don't really know. But this is the most optimistic sounding Leah has been in the entirety of this narrative of giving birth to children from Jacob. The optimism continues in the final birth recorded in verse 21. Afterward, she bore a daughter and named her Dinah. Now, the name Dinah means vindication, and the birth of daughters are not usually mentioned. They're not usually even highlighted. It's unusual for that to happen unless they play a significant role later on, which Dinah will do in chapter 34. And that concludes the third section of this very, very dysfunctional family. And that brings us to the last and final section, number 4, God remembered. Verse 22, then God remembered Rachel and God remembered Rachel, and God gave heed to her and opened her womb. So Rachel gives birth. Without usage of the superstitious mandrakes and without the maid, Rachel is going to give birth through the sovereign work of God. God remembered, God gave heed. Verse 23, so she conceived and bore a son and said, God has taken away my reproach. And verse 24, and she named him Joseph, saying, may the Lord give me another son. The name Joseph is a combination of the two phrases that Rachel uses here. God has taken away my reproach, and may the Lord give me another son. And it's difficult to assign a precise meaning to this name, and linguists simply point to these two phrases as the meaning, but some will reduce it down for simplistic reasons and say, may he add. So clearly, Rachel is not content with just a single child, and as we know, she will eventually give birth to a second son, Benjamin, and Rachel will die giving birth to that son. And so Jacob now has 12 children from 4 different women in a period of 7 years, and we ask ourselves, how could that possibly happen? 12 children in 7 years. Certainly that's not what we're supposed to think. Well, it's quite likely that these women were pregnant at the same time. There's an overlapping period of pregnancies and births. They're not necessarily successive births as we would read them in the narrative, which would make it quite plausible that there could be 12 births in 7 years. So we read through all of this and we come to what I think is the most important part. What's the lesson? We read all of this and we ask ourselves, what's the lesson here? There's a couple things, something I want to say that is not included here, but if we have to remember this, that I said this when we studied Genesis years ago when we went through the first part, Abraham. Moses recorded this most likely during the wilderness wanderings, and you have this mass of people in the neighborhood of 1 million plus who can now trace their lineage back to the sons that Jacob gave birth to. That's important for those people. That's not the lesson here, but that's important to remember. What are the lessons here? Number 1, God is sovereignly in control. He chooses to incorporate the most fallible and fallen people into his gracious plans. When you read about a family like this, you must ask yourselves, how could God do a significant work through that? It's through the fact that God is sovereignly in control. In spite of Jacob's prayerlessness, and in spite of Rachel and Leah's bitter rivalry for supremacy, and Laban's exploitive tactics, God blesses this family with 12 sons who will later father the 12 tribes of Israel. There's no other way. There's no other way except God's sovereign control. Number 2, God provides hope. We must never, ever forget that. God provides hope. What we find in this agonizing story of people's emptiness and self-inflicted pain is God's gracious gift of hope. These people lived half lives, blocked by sorrow and hostility and bitter competition. Leah has children, but not the love of her husband. Rachel has the love of her husband, but no children. And those in this half-life situation, the Bible offers neither reproach nor cliche, but God's seeing and remembering. To those longing for love, the faith offers not blame or meaningless words, but one who has come that we might have a full and abundant life as Jesus has promised. Thirdly, God's grace and mercy prevail. Our sovereign God mercifully builds up Israel by choosing the unloved and the needy. Both Rachel and Leah would fit the category of being unloved and of being needy. Leah wants a true husband, but instead finds God's mercy in bearing 6 of the 12 tribes of Israel, including the priestly and the messianic line. Rachel desires the social esteem of bearing children, but eventually God remembers and gives heed to her prayers. And amazingly, through the bitter jealousy and the superstition taint, the faith of the sisters, the merciful God grants through them the 12 tribes of Israel. Once again, it is divine grace and mercy. It is not human merit that establishes God's kingdom. There's no way that the people of Israel could look back on this narrative and say, look what Jacob did, look what Leah did, look what Rachel did. They would have to look back and say, in spite of Rachel and Jacob and Leah, look what God did. I think the bottom line is we must always learn to wait on Him. Right? That's why I put the song at the end, because we must learn to wait on God. Would you pray with me, please? Father, we know very well that life